There is something very strange happening around you right now, and I don't think you're fully aware of how deeply it has affected someone. Because someone found out who you really are, not the version of you they heard about, not the version somebody described to them, not the version they assumed you were based on one conversation, one mistake, one photograph, one period of your life, or one story that reached them through somebody else. I mean you, the real you. And whatever they discovered has made it difficult for them to look at you the same way again. I'm getting this very strange feeling of someone seeing you, then looking away. Almost like eye contact has suddenly become uncomfortable. And no, I don't mean because they're afraid of you in some dramatic way. It's more complicated than that. It's almost like when they look directly into your eyes, they remember something they learned about you, something they weren't prepared to know. Something that doesn't fit the version of you they had created in their head. And I need you to stay with me here, because this reading gets much deeper than somebody simply developing feelings for you, or suddenly realizing that you're attractive or interesting. That's not what I'm getting. What I'm getting is recognition, a very uncomfortable kind of recognition. The kind that happens when somebody realizes they've been looking at the surface of a person for a long time, and suddenly, somehow, they were given access to what exists underneath it. And once you see that in somebody, you can't completely unsee it. Okay, let me slow down for a second because something is coming through very strongly. There is somebody who has been watching you for longer than you realize, and I don't necessarily mean literally watching you. For some of you, yes, there may be somebody who checks your social media, notices when you're online, watches what you post, pays attention to who you're around. But for others, this is much quieter. It's somebody who has simply been observing. They've noticed the little things, the things you don't think anybody notices, the way you become quiet when something really matters to you, the way you behave when you're disappointed, the way you can be surrounded by people and somehow still keep the deepest part of yourself completely private, the way you don't always explain yourself, the way you can walk away from something without announcing that you're walking away. And this person has been collecting those details without even realizing they were doing it, until something happened, something was revealed, and suddenly all those little details connected. That's the moment I'm seeing, the moment where they looked at you and thought, oh, not oh they're different, not oh they're interesting, more like, I didn't know that's who you were. And there is almost a silence after that realization, because I don't think this person knows what to do with what they know now. For some of you, this is somebody who previously underestimated you. That's important. They thought they had you figured out. They thought you were predictable. They thought they knew what motivated you. They may have even thought you were easier to manipulate than you actually are. And then they found out something about you that completely disrupted that assumption. For others, this person thought you were emotionally detached. They thought you didn't care as much as other people. They thought your calmness meant you didn't feel deeply. And now they're realizing the opposite. You feel deeply. You simply don't display everything you feel. That's different, very different. And I need to tell you something, because this is where the reading begins to shift. The thing they discovered about you wasn't necessarily something you told them. In fact, I'm getting the opposite. You may not even know that they know. That's why this energy feels so strange. You have been moving through your life thinking one thing is happening, while this person has been quietly processing something completely different. They saw something, they heard something, somebody told them something, they witnessed you in a situation where you didn't know you were being observed, or they discovered something about your past, and suddenly they understood a part of you that had previously made no sense, and now every interaction with you carries that knowledge. That's why their eyes are different. That's why their behavior is different. That's why you may have noticed something without being able to put your finger on it. You might have caught them staring and then looking away. You might have noticed that they suddenly became quieter around you. You might have noticed that they're unusually careful with their words. Or maybe they're doing the opposite. Maybe they're talking too much, making jokes, acting casual, pretending absolutely nothing has changed. But you can feel that something has. And if you've been wondering whether you're imagining it, I don't think that's the real issue. The real issue is that you may be noticing a change without knowing what caused it. And that's what we're going into now. Because the first thing I need you to understand is that this person did not simply discover a fact about you. They discovered a contradiction. They discovered that the person they thought you were and the person you actually are not the same person. And that contradiction is what has them uncomfortable. Think about it. If somebody has already decided who you are, everything you do gets interpreted through that decision. If they think you're arrogant, confidence becomes arrogance. If they think you're distant, boundaries become rejection. If they think you're weak, kindness becomes weakness. If they think you're emotionally unavailable, privacy becomes indifference. If they think you're desperate, your interest becomes desperation. People don't always see you. Sometimes they see the story they already created about you. But this person recently received something that disrupted their story. And I'm getting a very strong feeling that they were almost embarrassed by how wrong they had been, not necessarily publicly, privately, the kind of embarrassment you feel when you realize you were confident about something that wasn't true, and suddenly they start replaying old interactions. That's what I'm seeing. They're going backward. They're remembering conversations, things you said, things you didn't say, the way you reacted to something months ago, the time you didn't argue, the time you walked away, the time you seemed completely unaffected, and now they're thinking, wait, was I misunderstanding that the entire time? And that's where the eye contact becomes important. Because every time they see you, their mind is comparing the person standing in front of them with the new information they have. And those two versions are colliding. Okay, I just got something. For some of you, this person learned something about what you've survived. That's very specific. They discovered that something you appeared to move through effortlessly was actually incredibly difficult for you. Maybe they thought you were cold when you were actually protecting yourself. Maybe they thought you didn't care when you were trying not to fall apart. Maybe they thought you had it easy because you never told them what it cost you to get where you are. And when they found out, something changed. Because now your strength looks different. Your silence looks different. Your independence looks different. Even the way you smile looks different. They are realizing that the person they thought was simply confident may have had to build that confidence from the ground up. And I don't think you understand how powerful that realization is for somebody who previously underestimated you. Because suddenly your behavior has context, the boundaries have context, the distance has context, the way you don't chase people has context, the way you can forgive without necessarily allowing somebody back into your life has context, the way you can love someone and still leave them alone has context. And this person is starting to understand that. But here's where it gets interesting. I don't think they learned all of this from you. There may have been another person involved. I'm seeing a conversation, not necessarily a dramatic conversation. Actually, it's quieter than that. Two people talking. One person knows something about you, the other person doesn't, and your name comes up. And the person who knows you says something like, "You don't really know them." That's the energy. And that sentence matters. Because the person listening had an opinion already. They had a picture. Maybe somebody had told them that you were difficult. Maybe they had heard that you were selfish. Maybe they were told you had changed. Maybe they thought you were arrogant. Maybe they believed you didn't care about anybody. And then somebody who actually knew something about your history corrected the picture. Not by defending you emotionally, by telling the truth. And that truth landed. Hard. Because now the person listening had to reconsider everything. This is why I keep seeing eyes. Eyes meeting. Eyes moving away. Someone not knowing where to look. Because there are certain things you can pretend not to understand until you actually see the person again. Then the knowledge becomes real. And this person is realizing, I've been looking at them completely wrong. Now, I want to be careful with something. This doesn't automatically mean this person is your soulmate. It doesn't automatically mean they're going to confess their love. It doesn't automatically mean they're going to come running towards you. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that something about their perception of you has changed. And sometimes that's more significant than attraction, because attraction can happen from the surface. Recognition happens deeper. And I'm getting that this person has moved from interest into curiosity, then from curiosity into introspection. And introspection is uncomfortable because now they have to ask themselves why they judged you the way they did. Why did they believe what they believed? Who gave them that information? Why were they so willing to accept it? Why didn't they look closer? And there may be a little guilt around that. A little, not overwhelming guilt, but enough. Enough to make them uncomfortable when you look directly at them, because your eyes aren't accusing them. That's the strange thing. You're not doing anything. You may not even know what happened. You're just standing there, and they're the ones carrying the knowledge. That's why the discomfort belongs to them, not you. And I need you to hear that. You don't need to fix their discomfort. You don't need to make eye contact harder or easier. You don't need to confront them. You don't need to ask, "What did you find out?" You don't need to expose anything. Because if this reading is resonating, something is already happening inside that person. They're processing, and processing takes time, especially when somebody discovers that the person they thought they understood has layers they never considered. Now, there is another layer here, and this one surprised me because I initially thought this was about somebody discovering your strength, but I'm getting something much more vulnerable. They discovered your softness, and that's different. They may have seen you as strong for a long time, but they didn't understand why. Then they saw the part of you that still cares, the part that still loves, the part that still gets hurt, the part that still wants to believe the best in people even after being disappointed. And something about that broke the image they had created. Because it's easy to label a strong person as cold. It's easy to assume somebody who doesn't chase you doesn't care. But then you discover that the same person who walked away was the person who spent hours trying to understand everybody else. You discover that the person who looked detached was actually carrying more emotion than anyone realized. And suddenly their behavior makes sense. I think that's one of the biggest revelations for this person. They didn't discover that you're emotionless. They discovered that you're selective with your emotions. That's a huge difference. And once they understand it, they may start seeing old moments differently. The quietness, the distance, the patience, the moments where you gave somebody another chance, the moments where you didn't. And there's something else. You may have a very particular way of looking at people. You look at them when they're talking. You notice things, you remember details, and this person may have recently realized that you've been seeing more than they thought. That's uncomfortable for somebody who prefers to control how they're perceived, because they may have assumed that they were hiding something from you, and now they're wondering, how much did they already know? That's a completely different kind of tension. Now they're not only processing what they learned about you, they're wondering what you have already figured out about them. And that is where I feel the energy getting very strong, because there is a possibility that this person has something of their own that they don't want exposed, not necessarily something terrible, maybe an emotion, maybe jealousy, maybe attraction, maybe regret, maybe guilt, maybe the fact that they've been thinking about you much more than they ever admitted, and now that they've learned something real about you, they're afraid that if they look directly into your eyes, you'll see that too. That's why they're looking away, not because they don't want to see you, because they don't know what you might see in them. That's the difference. And honestly, that part feels very strong. You may have wondered, why does this person act completely different around me? Because they are trying to regulate themselves. They're trying to decide which version of themselves to show you. And the problem is, they don't know which version you already know. Now let me bring in the spiritual side of this, because I keep getting an image of a veil lifting, not a veil disappearing completely, just enough for someone to see through. And when I think about that symbol, I don't think it's only about this other person. I think it's about you too, because you've spent a long time allowing people to know the version of you that was safe for them. Maybe not consciously, maybe it was survival. Maybe you learned early that showing people everything about you gave them too much power, so you learned to become private. You learned to smile through things. You learned to say, "I'm fine." You learned to keep certain dreams quiet. You learned not to tell everyone what you're planning. You learned that people don't always deserve access to your inner world simply because they're curious. And now something has changed. You're not necessarily becoming more open. You're becoming more authentic. There's a difference. You don't feel the same need to perform the version of yourself that makes everybody comfortable. And people notice that. especially people who knew you before. That's why some of them may seem confused. They keep looking for the old version, but the old version isn't available in the same way anymore. And this person has just realized that. That's the deepest thing I'm getting. They didn't simply discover a secret about you. They discovered that you were never who they thought you were. And strangely enough, that may be a compliment, because you were never supposed to fit inside the story they created for you. Now, I want to go back to the person who told them something, because I don't think this information came randomly. There is someone around you who understands more about your history than most people do. They may not be your closest friend, they may not even speak to you regularly, but they know. And at some point, they corrected the narrative. Maybe they said, "You don't know what that person has been through." Maybe they said, "That's not what happened." Maybe they simply gave context, and that little bit of context changed everything, because sometimes one piece of truth is enough to destroy an entire false story. And that's what I see happening. A story is collapsing, not loudly, quietly, inside somebody's mind. And that person is going back through old memories trying to reconstruct you correctly. That's why the energy feels slow. This isn't a sudden emotional explosion. It's an internal reorganization. They are rebuilding their understanding of you, and that can make somebody very quiet, very awkward, very observant, very careful. So if you've noticed someone acting strangely, don't immediately assume it's rejection. Don't immediately assume it's dislike. Don't immediately assume you've done something wrong. Sometimes people become awkward when their perception changes. They don't know how to interact with the new version of what they know. And there is something else coming through here. This person may have previously felt superior to you in some way, not necessarily openly, but internally. They thought they knew more. They thought they understood you. They thought they could predict your choices. They thought they had emotional leverage. And now, that leverage isn't there, because they realize something. You can leave. You can detach. You can survive without being understood. You can love someone without begging them to stay. You can lose something and still become more yourself afterward. And that realization is powerful, because the person who thought you needed their approval suddenly realizes you don't. That's a different kind of shock. And it may be why they can't look you in the eyes, because your eyes represent something now. They represent the version of you they underestimated, the version they didn't see, the version they didn't know existed. Okay, I'm getting another very specific image. Someone sees you laughing with other people, and for a moment they just stop. They're watching you be completely normal, completely yourself, and they're thinking about the information they recently received. And suddenly they realize something. You didn't become who you are because of them. That's important. They may have assumed they had some kind of influence over your identity. They didn't. You were becoming yourself long before they understood it. And maybe that's the part that bothers them most. You didn't need their permission. You didn't need their validation. You didn't need them to recognize your depth before you could have it. And now they're finally recognizing it after the fact. There's a strange justice in that. Not revenge, not punishment, just recognition arriving late. And sometimes recognition arriving late is all life gives people. Now, for some of you, this has a romantic layer. I'm not going to ignore that. There is somebody who may have developed feelings they weren't prepared for. But again, the feelings aren't the whole story. The feelings became stronger because they learned something about your character. They discovered something about the way you love. Maybe they learned that you're loyal. Maybe they learned that you kept a promise when nobody would have blamed you for breaking it. Maybe they learned that you protected somebody who couldn't give you anything in return. Maybe they discovered that you're not as selfish as someone made you seem. And suddenly attraction has a foundation. It's not fantasy anymore. They're seeing substance. And substance is harder to dismiss. For others, this isn't romantic at all. It could be a coworker, a former friend, a family member, somebody connected to your social circle, someone who simply had the wrong impression. That's why I'm not going to force one identity onto this reading. What matters is the shift. Someone's perception of you has changed, and the change came from something real. Now let's talk about what happens next, Because I don't think the next phase is you chasing this person for answers. Actually, I think it's the opposite. The more you continue doing what you've been doing, living, growing, becoming quieter about what doesn't deserve explanation, the more obvious the difference becomes. They will have to approach you differently, because the old version of the relationship was based on an assumption, and that assumption is gone. This person may become more respectful, more careful, more curious. They may ask questions. They may find reasons to be around you. They may try to start conversations that seem casual but aren't. They may mention something from your past just to see how you respond. They may test the waters. And you'll know, not because somebody announces, "I have discovered who you really are," but because their behavior changes, their attention changes, their questions change, their energy changes, their eyes change. And here's the important part. You don't have to reward them immediately for finally seeing you. Let them see. Let them process. Let them sit with what they learned, because being understood is valuable. But it doesn't mean everyone who finally understands you automatically earns access to you. That's something I really want you to take from this reading. Recognition is not the same as permission. Someone can finally see your worth and still not be entitled to your life. Someone can regret misunderstanding you and still have consequences to face. Someone can realize they judged you incorrectly and still have to rebuild trust. You don't have to rush that process. You don't have to make it easier for them. And you don't have to punish them either. You can simply observe. That's your power here. Observe, because you've spent enough time trying to understand everybody else. Now let people reveal themselves to you. And I think that's part of your larger lesson. You've been learning the difference between intuition and anxiety, between discernment and suspicion, between compassion and self-abandonment, between forgiveness and allowing repeated access, between loving someone and losing yourself inside their needs. And this situation is showing you that you're getting better at those distinctions. That's why I don't want you to focus only on the person who can't look you in the eyes. I want you to notice who you have become, because maybe a year ago this would have consumed you. You would have asked, "What did I do? Why are they acting weird? Do they hate me? Should I message them? Should I explain? Should I ask?" And now, maybe you're simply noticing. That's growth. You don't need to investigate every strange energy. You don't need to solve every person's reaction. You don't need to make yourself smaller so someone else feels comfortable. And there is a very strong message here about your eyes too, because I think you've been looking outward for confirmation. You've been trying to read everyone else's face, their expression, their tone, their silence, their distance, their reactions. But this chapter is asking you to look inward. What do you know? What have you sensed? What have you learned? What has your experience taught you? And what are you finally willing to trust? Because your intuition isn't supposed to make you paranoid. It's supposed to make you discerning. There's a difference. And if this reading is yours, I think you've been learning that difference the hard way. You have been through enough situations where your first instinct was correct, but you talked yourself out of it because you wanted to give people the benefit of the doubt. And that's beautiful. But there comes a point where compassion without discernment becomes self-betrayal. You're not there anymore. You're learning to listen. You're learning to pause. You're learning that someone's explanation doesn't automatically erase your experience. And that is part of who this person has just discovered. They didn't just discover that you're strong. They discovered that you're aware, and that may be why they can't quite look away from you. Because once someone realizes that you see more than you say, they become very conscious of themselves around you, and that can be intimidating, especially if they're used to controlling the narrative. Now I want to talk about the timing. I'm getting a sense of something unfolding in stages rather than all at once. First, there is distance, then curiosity, then observation, then an attempt at communication, then a moment where something is finally acknowledged. It might not be a huge confession. It could be something small, a question, a message, a strangely honest comment, an apology disguised as casual conversation, a reference to something from the past, something that lets you know they know more than they used to. And when that happens, don't feel pressured to reveal everything. You can answer what you want to answer. You can keep what belongs to you. Because part of becoming the real version of yourself is understanding that authenticity doesn't mean total accessibility. You can be authentic and private. You can be honest and mysterious. You can be kind and have boundaries. You can forgive and still remember. You can love and still walk away. Those aren't contradictions. That's maturity. And I think that's exactly what somebody is beginning to see in you. They thought they were looking at a simple person. They're realizing you're not simple, not because you're complicated for the sake of being complicated, but because you've lived enough life to have layers. You've survived things you didn't advertise. You've learned things you didn't announce. You've changed in ways people didn't witness. And now somebody is catching up to a transformation that happened quietly. That's why their reaction feels delayed. Your transformation happened before their realization. They are only now seeing the result. And here's the part that I think is going to matter most to you. Stop waiting for them to confirm it. You already know what you've survived. You already know how hard you've worked. You already know what you've had to overcome. You already know the moments when you could have become bitter but chose not to. You already know the nights you had to rebuild yourself privately. You already know the things you never told anybody. So if someone finally discovers who you really are, let that be their journey. You don't need to become louder so they can hear you. You don't need to prove your depth. You don't need to perform your goodness. You don't need to convince anybody that you're worth knowing. The right people don't need a presentation. They observe, they learn, they understand, and they adjust. That's what this person is doing now, adjusting. And I think that's why the eye contact is so uncomfortable. Because they're no longer looking at the person they thought you were. They're looking at someone they finally understand is much deeper, and there may be one final realization coming for them. They may realize that the version of you they had access to before was actually the version you were willing to give them. They never had the whole story. They had a chapter, and they mistook the chapter for the entire book. Now they're discovering the book is much bigger, and honestly, I think that's beautiful. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply continue becoming. You don't have to announce every transformation. You don't have to tell people, look how much I've changed. You just change. And eventually people who haven't been paying attention notice. They look again, and they realize that's not the same person. But you know what? You don't have to say anything. Let them wonder, let them learn, let them watch, let them understand at their own pace. Because your life isn't a classroom where everyone gets unlimited access to the lesson. Some people will understand you late. Some people will misunderstand you forever. Some people will leave. Some people will return. Some people will finally see you clearly. And some people will look directly at you and still refuse to see. That's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to remain honest with yourself. And I think that's the real spiritual message here. This isn't ultimately a reading about somebody else's eyes. It's about your own ability to see clearly, to see yourself without the distortions other people placed on you, to see your own strength without needing somebody else to admire it, to see your own softness without calling it weakness, to see your own boundaries without calling them selfishness, to see your own intuition without calling it paranoia, to see your own growth without needing an audience. Because once you can do that, it becomes much harder for somebody else's misunderstanding to control you. And maybe that's why this person is uncomfortable. Because they finally see something you have been slowly learning for yourself. You are not who people said you were. You are not the worst thing you ever did. You are not the version of yourself that existed during your lowest season. You are not the label somebody put on you because they didn't understand you. You are not the rumor. You are not the misunderstanding. You are not the person someone needed you to be so they could feel better about themselves. You are the person who kept going. You are the person who learned. You are the person who became more discerning. You are the person who stopped begging to be understood. And that's why the energy around you is changing. Because when you stop performing for people, people have to decide whether they actually want to know you. And somebody just made that decision. They want to know, but they don't know how to approach you anymore. That's what I'm seeing. They're standing on the other side of a perception that has collapsed. They are looking at you differently, and you're probably going to notice. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but through a small behavior, a different tone, a longer glance, a question that feels oddly personal, a message that seems casual but carries something underneath it, a moment where they almost say something and stop. Pay attention to patterns, not isolated moments. That's important. Don't build an entire story around one look. Let reality show you what is real. That's discernment. And if something genuine is meant to come forward, it won't require you to chase it into existence. It will have a way of becoming clearer. That's what I want you to remember. You don't have to force clarity. You can allow clarity to arrive. And for those of you who have been waiting for someone to finally understand you, I know that can be exhausting. But maybe the lesson wasn't to make them understand. Maybe the lesson was to stop needing them to. Because the moment you stop needing someone else's recognition, their recognition becomes much less powerful over you. And ironically, that's often when it arrives, when you're no longer waiting for it, when you've already moved on, when you've already decided, I know who I am. That's when somebody else suddenly looks at you and realizes it too. So yes, someone may have found out something about who you really are, something they didn't expect, something that changed the way they interpret your silence, something that changed the way they interpret your silence, something that made them realize they never had the whole story, and now they're having trouble looking you directly in the eyes. But don't mistake their discomfort for your responsibility. Let them process, let them learn, let them sit with the realization, and you keep becoming. Keep your peace, keep your discernment, keep your softness, keep your boundaries, keep the parts of yourself that you once thought you had to hide, because the right people won't be frightened by discovering more of you. They'll be grateful they finally got close enough to see it. And if this reading found you at exactly the right moment, tell me in the comments what part connected with you. You don't have to give away anything personal. You can simply say, I see clearly now, because I have a feeling that's the real message underneath everything we've talked about. Not that somebody finally sees you, but that you are finally seeing yourself clearly enough that somebody else's opinion can no longer define you. And if you're wondering about a specific person, a specific connection, what they discovered, what they're feeling now, or what happens next between you, a general reading can only go so far. A personal reading can look more specifically at the people, circumstances, and timings surrounding your situation. But whether you get one or not, remember this: you don't need to chase anyone into seeing your value. You don't need to explain every scar. You don't need to prove every intention. You don't need to convince someone that there is more to you than what they first saw. Let people discover you naturally. Let the ones who are meant to understand, and let the ones who aren't remain outside the door, because you are entering a part of your life where being misunderstood is no longer enough to make you abandon yourself. And someone may have just discovered who you really are. But the deeper revelation is this: you are finally becoming someone who no longer needs to be discovered by everyone. And that changes everything.